ability to get things done tells us a lot about a society. In the medieval period, power tends to be more visible on the elite general scale in the battles, military campaigns, and infighting in kingdoms, but it is harder to see how the kings, nobles, and armies were supported at the local level. When considering power in the first millennium in Scotland, we have a very fragmented picture from the evidence. So we need to evaluate and use all that we can to build up a more complete picture. I'm one of a team of researchers participating in the Leverhulme Trust funded Comparative Kingship, the Early Medieval Kingdoms of Northern Britain and Ireland project. This involves a number of scholars in Scotland and Ireland, led by Professor Gordon Noble of the University of Aberdeen. The Comparative Kingship project adopts an interdisciplinary approach using many types of evidence alongside the comparative method. It considers 4 key questions. One is to understand late Roman and post-Roman kingship in Northern Europe. The other is to uncover the rise and fall of central places in Northern Britain and Ireland. And researching these involves investigating Ireland and Northern Britain generally, but we are focusing particularly on Munster in Ireland, Pictland in Scotland, and also Dál Riata in both. Most attention is concentrated on 4 case study areas: Cashel and its environs in Munster, the coastal site of Dunseverick in County Antrim for Dál Riata, and the Burghead area by the Murray Firth, and also Rainey in inland Aberdeenshire for Pictland. So we're investigating archaeological sites in these regions, such as those in Rainey's environs, and we are considering the textual evidence, and also we're working on place names and territories, such as lordships, kingdoms, parishes, and smaller units, such as like townlands in Ireland. So our third objective in the project is tracking the environmental context of first millennium polities, studying core samples for pollen and geochemical analysis to identify past vegetation change, including evidence for pastoral and arable farming, and also looking for traces of metalworking in localities. This, alongside analysis of the human, animal, and fish bones found at sites, will allow us to assess the impacts that major central places had on the landscape, alongside broader environmental changes. And our fourth objective is to radiocarbon date new samples and redate older ones in order to provide shorter, more precise date ranges for sites. So, for instance, using material from previous excavations, we have shown that the period when the hillside at Clatchett Craig, just south of the Tay, the period when that was a fortification was largely confined to the 7th century AD. So we're attempting to combine all of this evidence to gain a better picture of how areas not incorporated into the Roman world in the ancient period, were how they developed and how they can compare with the rest of Europe. So this is comparative in an international and also in a British and Irish context. Research for the project is ongoing, so much of what I'll be saying is very provisional and hopefully will be improved through further work. I'll be focusing mainly today on Scotland, in particular on the 2 case study areas we're looking at around Burghead in Murray and Rainey in Aberdeenshire, as well as looking at some general evidence relating to the Picts. First, what I'll be doing is looking at the broader evidence, looking at local control and support through this Pictish evidence. The first references to the Picts appear at the end of the 3rd century AD and continue to the early 10th century. A couple of Pictish groups are mentioned in the Roman period in the 4th century AD, but more individual Pictish territories and polities are mentioned only centuries later, from the 7th centuries onwards. Such references that we do have are unlikely to be comprehensive, So there are likely to be many more territories and groups in existence than we know of. And it's also likely that some of the later territories in Scotland that appear in sources from the 10th century onwards had origins in that early period. I think it's fair to say that our understanding of this topic in terms of the territories of Pictland has been transformed by Alex Wolff's positioning of the major dominant territory and kingship of Fortriu in the north rather than in the south as it used to be thought of. It makes the northern Picts much more prominent than we thought of before. From the late 7th century onwards, the kings of Fortriu usually, if not always, were also regarded as kings of the Picts, presumably partly by their own self-promotion. They seem to have been over-kings, dominant over lesser kings, and also other regional and local leaders. From 900 AD, using a Gaelic name and becoming a Gaelic in language and culture, the kings were called the kings of Alba, who also came to be known as the kings of the Scots, or that is, of Scotland. By the 12th century, the main royal centres were in what had been southern Pictland, between the Forth and the Mouth. And this is a map of some of them. Exactly how that power shift took place is uncertain, though it may already have taken place or have been happening by the 9th century. Many of these places start being mentioned in the 9th century, so it's possible the shift had happened by at least partly by then. From the documentary sources, we see that there seem to have been a number of shifts in the type of power centres and their locations that we can see compared to the earlier period. In our text, we have lots of forts mentioned in the 7th and 8th centuries, but there are fewer mentioned afterwards. And also from the 9th century onwards, we start to get references to different, less defensive royal centres, Palatia like Fortiviat and the elusive Kenmore, perhaps just north of Perth, and also the site at Scone. Steve Driscoll has argued that this represents a shift in elite sites from hill forts to lowland, undefended, more Christian ceremonial centres. Scone was mentioned in the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba as a location of a large secular and ecclesiastical assembly that took place in the early 10th century. Similarly, Fortiviat was where King Dovnal in the middle of the 9th century made, apparently along with the Gaels, made law again in the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba. That may be true, but I think we have to recognize that the evidence base for our understanding of these royal centres in these texts shifts away from the Iona Chronicle, which mentions a lot of forts, to sources that don't mention so many and mention other places instead. So I think it'll be primarily archaeology that will be able to test whether Steve Driscoll's hypothesis is correct or not. So what happened at elite Pictish centres and how did they connect to wider society? Well, a very interesting source that gives us some idea, albeit a distorted and idealised one, is the Life of St Columba by Aberfnan of Iona. He was the abbot and probably wrote the text around about 700 AD. This has a depiction in a number of episodes of a power centre of a Pictish king called Brithay, who was residing near the River Ness in the Great Glen. This source describes a fort, probably an elevated one, with gates, a royal hall, and a royal house where Brithay resides with his followers, who are described, the word is familiares, and they seem to have considerable status since both they and Brithay make the decision to send the equestrian messengers to Columba when Brithay's wizard Throican gets in trouble. Brithay also has Thesaurus, a place for royal treasures, which presumably could be one which should travel around him when he goes around the kingdom. Elsewhere, elsewhere in the text, Brithay has a sub-king of Orkney in attendance on him at his royal centre, and this shows the need for local potentates to come to the over-king, so that you can see a structure of kingship here. So we can overall, piecing all these fragments together, get a picture of a court government with a king and his key followers helping him to rule, and rule is focused, in this case, at least in this text, at an elite defensive structure. And this would be the earlier phase, presumably the text was written around 700 AD. However, this doesn't really help us to understand how this court government worked in the wider realm. We can guess from the assemblies at Scone and Forteviot that I've already mentioned that there were assemblies at a broad, perhaps kingdom level, by the middle of the 9th century or 10th century, early 10th century at the latest. But the Brithay episodes don't show us how the king, his sub-kings, his familiares, and other rulers operated and got their support throughout the land. When considering how power operated at a local level, we are generally left in Pictland with working back from later sources, considering place names and units such as lordships, parishes, and a smaller unit called the davers. Recent research by David Brune and Alice Taylor on the post-1100 evidence has clarified the picture before we get radical changes taking place in the middle of the 12th century and later. Immediately before these changes, power structures seem to have been dominantly kin-based, and most royal officials stayed with the king. Regional and local power was territorial, based on the provincia, but lords did not really have a deep, direct control or influence in local communities in all of the province that they were in charge of. Instead, power was exercised by the Morves in provinces, and maybe also by more local leaders, leaders such as the Taoiseach, and their lordship was overall extensive, often operating through the consent and with consultation, the consultation of other local elites, partly in these assemblies. Morves were leaders of the province's men in campaigns as well. They also were probably involved in local justice, judging cases of potential theft. And that may sound minor, but the punishment was death. So it's quite a major issue for the person concerned. The Kingdom of Alba used a single system with what were known as warrantors, people who were supposed to vouch for someone's ownership of property when it was initially purchased. Warrantors had to come to a particular place in each province to prove ownership if there was a dispute. And these places seem to have been generally significant pre-existing judicial sites, indicating that the system overall was earlier, probably with the Morve of that province in charge. However, we can't assume that power was static before 1100. For instance, the name Morve itself meant great or sea steward. It presumably originally was a Pictish royal official position, which was later monopolized by local elite kindreds by the 12th century at the latest. In Athol, one of these morvedoms, we still have evidence in the Irish Chronicles for a king being well, alive, and then he's killed in the year 739 AD. And it is clear that after this point, this kingdom became a province with a morve. But the sequence of change may have been different elsewhere. There may have been one local ruler becoming a morve from a different position. Power at a local level was based on various dues and obligations, and this created a network of relationships across society, the most conspicuous being that between clients and their lords. So by the 12th century, there are also three what are called as common burdens raised for the king. That is military service, public works, and aids. So public works is also known as labour service, basically. And aids was one which may have been a new imposition put on people in the 12th century. And that was primarily a render or payment for supplying the army, particularly when on campaigns. These common burdens, also called royal service, were raised on local units called the davach, which subdivided each parish. Alistair Ross showed in much of his research how ubiquitous the davachs once were across nearly all of Pictland, though in many places they were later replaced by different units of valuation, as you'll find in the study areas I'm looking at. He was able in some areas to map the davachs and to show that they probably had preceded the parishes that they're found in. So the parish is the unit to support the local church, and the davachs are usually found with multiples inside each parish. Since the medieval parishes we know of were formalized in the 12th and early 13th centuries, this would mean that the davachs were earlier than that. But although Ross regarded davachs as a royal creation, a system developed in the late 8th century, according to his argument, they are actually quite diverse in different areas of Pictland. As you can see on the slide, they can be what Ross described as self-contained davachs, as in Glass Parish, or they can be divided into multiple parts, as in much of Lagan Parish in Tapanoth. And Ross identified also units that could be classed as 2 or 3 davach units, particularly in the area around Inverness and the Pictish fort of Craig Fardrick, and in the same area. So this diversity, I think, means that these davachs were not necessarily created at a single time to a single standard. It's instead best to regard them as being evolving units with varying origins, which all have become classed as davachs. When we look at these local case studies to look at what these local units were in practice and their parish centres, what should we be looking for? So I've already discussed some of the things we could look at. We can search for the circular centres like forts, halls and residences, and also ecclesiastical centres such as churches, monasteries, and chapels and bishops' palaces. We can also identify, or try to identify, more public places where decisions were made, such as assembly and judicial sites. We can look for locations for socialising, for markets, and where renders were collected and maybe distributed from. But there is the question of what levels we should be looking for each type of central places. Should we be looking at the settlement, the davach, the parish, or the regional level? So for each type of collective obligation, there would need to have been decision-making involving particular places where those actions would have been taken place. Since renders were made at the settlement, davach, and parish level, presumably at each there would have been hubs for bringing renders. And lords also, we know, had their own centres of collection where they collected produce from their subordinates, as Dovert Brune has recently identified at various shires, small units, not as big as our current shires. And you can see these in places like Fife, and he argues that these were centres of lordship, which were the centres of lordship of thanes and Taoiseach, or Taoiseach, the Gaelic for thane. So there are these various ways in which this could work. We can also, thinking of the davach unit in particular, we can think that these ones clearly had collective obligations, as I've already mentioned. So they presumably had hubs for musters, as for war, for this labour service, that I mentioned, and also perhaps for auxilia, the use of aids to support armies to get those renders for that. So assembly sites at this level looks very plausible, but it's possible that the situation varied according to locality overall and how exactly all the obligations were done. And there's the prominence of particular places and localities, like the Rainey area, produced a different pattern from other areas. Our project is attempting to understand this by studying 2 Scottish case study areas using multiple methods. But it has to be said that even when we have studied this, unfortunately, much evidence has been lost or still will await investigation. So we can only expect to get a partial picture. What I've done so far is very much incomplete and needs, I think, still to be connected more than I have done to the rest of the project's work. And I think that will produce more interesting results, especially as more archaeological environmental investigation takes place. So what I'll be largely limiting is to discussing some of what I've found so far and linking it as well as I can. Starting first with Rainey and its hinterland in the western edge of Aberdeenshire. The project has had a focus on Rainey, which has an impressive cluster of Pictish sculpted stones, which have been known for a long time, and where archaeologists had already found an impressive enclosure with ramparts and a hall and many finds at the site of what is known as the Crawstain. It was clearly a significant elite centre with secular, religious, manufacturing and distribution dimensions, and it dates from the 4th to 6th centuries AD. The intention of our project is to deepen our understanding of Rainey and its hinterland to see how the broader landscape was interrelated with this site and also how things changed over time. So the project has investigated other sites in the area, which is an Iron Age site to the southwest of Rainey. We've also looked at Kenmore, which is a circular hilltop site to southeast of Rainey in what was the medieval parish of Ken, and that's on the north side of the Careen Hills. And we've also looked at Tapanoth, the major imposing hilltop site to the northwest of Rainey. Recent work on Kenmore has shown that that site had a substantial timber-laced enclosure, a large central building, and was occupied from the 5th to 7th centuries. We've also looked at Tapanoth, which is a hill of 563 meters height above sea level, and has a major oblong enclosure rampart at the top of the hill. It also has a lower embankment enclosing a much wider area, and in that area there's been known that there's a number of platforms there. It was assumed that all of this was from the Iron Age, from say about 400 BC or the centuries around that. But recent investigation by Gordon Noble has found that the lower enclosure is much later. And also that 2 of the platforms that have been excavated by our project, that they also date from the medieval period. So the dates are roughly, we're getting are from the late 3rd century AD to the early 7th century in the date range that we have so far. So much later than we assumed. In addition, LiDAR, I think this is LiDAR, I'm not completely sure, but a number of extra platform sites, a massive increase on the previous number, up to 800 platforms are now identified on this site in the lower enclosure. So in the area that is that seems to be having evidence from the late Roman and early medieval periods. So this seems to be a very big centre which may have been occupied permanently or seasonally. But it's also interesting in the later phase that the top part, the fort at the top, wasn't occupied. So there are activities taking place around it that relate to that summit site, but seem to be referencing it in a way that makes it special. So overall, our archaeological investigation has transformed our understanding of the area, with 3 significant places being found in relatively close proximity to each other in the period from the 4th to 7th centuries AD. They're probably multifunctional, as Gordon Noble has suggested, and also interrelated to each other, although the exact interrelationships aren't clear. This area isn't one which is mentioned in any textual sources in the period in the 1st millennium AD that we know of. It appears first in textual evidence in an early 12th century source that in a reference description of the death of King Lulach, a king of Alba who was based in Murray, and his death is in 1058 AD is described as taking place in Essie in Strathbogie. So Essie is to the west of Rainey, and this Lulach was the nephew of Macbeth, who was also a king of Alba from Murray. So we have, in this point, this is the earliest reference to the area, Strathbogie, which was also the name for a later lordship in the area, which included the parish of Rainey as well as Essie. It means the valley of the Bogie, the river that was the most significant in the immediate area. But interestingly, as Gordon Noble has pointed out, the focus of the lordship, when it came to be further north at Huntly in the later medieval period, it was to north of the confluence of the Deveron and the Bogie rivers, and actually included lands that weren't in the valley of the Bogie at all. But the name seems to indicate that the Bogie River was, and its valley was a significant one in the earlier period. So for our study, what we're doing is looking at a geographical area around the site at Rainey. I'm looking at parishes and place names and territories in the area around Rainey in the centre of this map. These were located in a number of different lordships in the late medieval period. There's Rainey, Essie, Gartley, and Edindia parish, which is in Gartley parish now. They are all part of the lordship of Strathbogie. You also have the lordship of the Geary, which included Cynethmont and Rathmuriel parish. We have Clat, which was part of the lordship of the bishops of Aberdeen, and the parishes of Auchindour and Cairn were part of the later earldom of Mar. So these were all places that by the late medieval period were on the edges. They weren't the centre parts of any of these lordships. But it's important to remember that this area was one which was at the junction of important routeways, north to south, to the sea, to north, to the south through Donside. To the east, you could get to down the Uri to Aberdeen, and west you could go over to the Cabrach and over to Speyside and then to Murray through that way. So it's an important centre strategically in any period. The area isn't mountainous, but it does have substantial upland areas as well as the valleys. In the 18th century sources, it's clear that people there undertook arable and pastoral agriculture, and that there were areas of mosses as well, from where people took peat for fuel. Samantha Jones's work for our project has involved studying a core sample from near Rainey, from near the church. And that core sample has shown that the area has was undertaking arable and pastoral farming in the early medieval period. And interestingly, that although there may have been a bit of a decline in the late 6th and early 7th centuries when many of the sites like Tapanoth, Kenmore and Rainey fell out of use, that it wasn't major, that it was also one where the agricultural use recovered, and from around about 800 AD it increased again. So it's not one where there's been massive changes in the overall agricultural use of the area, but there's more continuity overall. So what we're seeing then is a shift in the sites of where the elites were involved and where maybe communities were involved, but not necessarily in the economic use of the area. When we consider the later textual evidence and place name evidence, I'm sorry for the huge number of arrows which I put on this map. What we can see is that the parish boundaries in the area often follow natural features. It's hard to see, but the western edges and the outer edges usually following the watersheds of the hills. And then also in the middle, you're seeing usually that the rivers are the boundaries for many of the parishes. This doesn't seem, if you're looking at the central part of the map, you can see that Rainey is right on the edge of a number of parish boundaries, very close to a number of parishes. And it isn't strategically a place that would be very safe if all those parishes were controlled by different people. So it seems likely that we can see here that the parish boundaries were not produced at the time when people were contesting the landscape, or at least there were settled territorial units that these parishes were being based on. So we can also see, we can look at the secular and ecclesiastical centres in these parishes. Some of them have become bigger than they once were, like Gartley Parish in the north of the study area. Used to have another parish, used to be two parishes, the parish of Edindiach. We don't know the boundaries between them, but that was subsumed into Gartley Parish in the early modern period. So some of the secular centres are quite hard to find, but what we do tend to find is, you can see from this just about that the secular centres tend to be close to the parish centres. We can, in many of these parishes, there's quite a close relationship, and also it's difficult to see from this map, but many of them are either close to the bogey in the centre or on major confluences from it. The exceptions being on the east side in Clatt Parish, there's the centre of the parish at Clatt, and to the south of it, Knock-Esbach is to the south of it, and these are close to the Gadyburn, which flows eastwards into the Uri. And also in Knethmont, you get Side, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, and Knethmont itself, which are not, they're relatively close to the bogey, but they're sort of in between, roughly on the very low-lying watershed between that and rivers and burns that flow eastwards. So there's generally looks though that there's a clustering more in the centre, more to the rivers closer to the bogey or going into it. So it seems likely that there was, at the time of the creation of these parishes, a benefit in the parish centre, in the church centre, and the secular centre being close to each other. The form of these parishes, as I say, was fixed in the 12th or early 13th centuries, usually thought to be based on pre-existing lordship. So it gives us something of a snapshot of what was going on in that 12th and early 13th centuries. Some of them may have been based on earlier units, but some may have been more new formations. To get back earlier, it's important to look at smaller units that divided the parish, such as the Davach. studied by Alistair Ross. So this is one picture of one or two was the secular centre of Auchendur, and then there's Moat Hill, which is right beside it, which may be a 12th century motte, and Bailey Place, but could be something earlier. And so to look at, understand some of these smaller units, smaller than the parish, we can look at a number of 18th century maps, and we're really lucky that the NLS has recently digitized and put up online a number of these maps, and so has Scotland's People website. Much of the ones we have for the Rainey area were produced and preserved by the Gordon Lords of Huntly, which was the lordship, which was the successor to the lordship of Strathbogie. And it's fantastic that so many have been made available, I think, since the lockdown. And they provide lots of detail. They allow us to gain an insight into the places and units in these parishes at a time when the landowners were attempting to improve the landscape. So you get, say, on this map, you can see here, which is part of the lordship of Huntly, you get the coloured lines, which are showing where the lords want the parish, the boundaries of some of these units to be, and you get dotted lines where the boundaries are when they were doing the actual survey. So they're really useful in showing us what these parishes were like internally. They include the boundaries of these units, which are called possessions, or sometimes in these plans they're called farms as well. And they usually consist of some settlements and farms with fields put together. We get in some of these maps lists of these possessions, including tables with the renders due from each of them, and also the land use, what the sort of coverage is of the landscape, indicating overall that these are the key economic units that are in each of these parishes. The maps also include areas that are outside these units called possessions. And they are generally the mosses and bogs, and also the upland areas that multiple possessions had access to. So, for instance, in this map, we get here this, as I say, part of Rainey parish, and you can see that, well, as the map states, the area which is on the eastern side, the right-hand side of the map, which is the Hill of North, Tapanoth, and also Kirkney Hill, those are described on the map as being common land for the possessions that are around, immediately adjacent to it. So what we can do from these maps is create our own maps from them, piecing together the evidence we get and mapping them so we can then analyse them. I've only so far done the ones for Rainey parish, where there's about 50 or so units in that parish. That was, Rainey parish was originally in the medieval period two parishes, Essie in the west and middle, and Rainey in the east side. So I haven't yet been able to identify the boundary between the two parishes. Interestingly, we see in one of the key plans, we get the possessions being listed and then linked together. You can see just about that you get the top there, Smithstown and Milne of Smithstown, Howtoun of Ditto, Miltoun of North, Crofthead of Ditto, and so on. So what it's basically saying is that some of these possessions are actually can be grouped together with the first one. So Howtoun of Smithstown is basically what it is. So what you can do is group these ones together, and then you can understand that there are bigger units involved here. And these are the units that appear in late medieval sources, sometimes valued as a daver. So you can start to understand how this maps onto some of the later medieval and early modern evidence that is earlier. And it's likely that there are other davas in Rainey parish that we don't know of that just aren't mentioned as being a dava. And that what you can see overall over time is that there was a process of division going on. I'm not saying that that was always the case, but overall, over hundreds of years, it seems to be what we're seeing overall. We can't regard the boundaries of these units as completely set in stone. We have, for instance, on these maps and also in charters earlier on, evidence for disputes. So, for instance, in the two of these maps, we see that there's a dispute between the people of Essie in the parish and also the people of New Murdrum, another possession in the parish, over land to the west in the western part of the parish. And then this overall shows that the ownership of these units could sometimes change hands and the boundaries could be changed as these disputes were settled as well. But it also, I think, is really important to see that in these the documents, you can see that the references are that it's the people of these units sometimes, as well as the lords who are being involved. And that these units, as well as being important for administration, were also important for the people who lived in them as ways in which they identified with their landscape and used their landscape as well. Their early origin is indicated by their names. So we have often, when you look at some of the bigger units, they are Gaelic or Pictish. So, for instance, Skurdag is Gaelic Skur as Jerug, meaning red scar or pointed rock. We have Murdrum, which includes the Gaelic element drum, ridge. We have also with Noth, an area that Simon Taylor, the place name specialist, has recently argued is potentially a Pictish element, meaning bare or exposed, if it isn't a Gaelic element meaning the same thing. And what we see in the parish of Rainey is there are a number of different possessions that have this Noth element in, and seems to have been covered a large area. So that area also includes the Hill of Noth and Tapanoth, where the hill fault is. And we also get other possession names mentioned elsewhere. So for instance, in the Gartley parish to the north, we have names with the element Tulloch, meaning a small hill, which seems in the Scottish context to often be used potentially for assembly places in a number of instances. We have, or judicial centres. We also get, Gartley itself is one of these names and was the centre of a castle. There's also in this parish a place called Shanka, which has Gaelic Shaun, Old and Caher, seat or fort. And we have the place name Drumbolg, which is used for a group of possessions, and in early sources is Doon fort. So we get some idea of some of the central places in key possessions being sort of central important centres in themselves. And looking back at Rainey itself, the place name Rainey, as Juliana Grigg first argued, seems to come from a Celtic word meaning very royal place, indicating that this is a key centre for a kingship that we don't know anything about otherwise, apart from the fact that it has a place name, the important collection of sculpture, and now the important complex that's been found in the area. In the same parish, there's also Lesmore, which is Gaelic les, enclosure, and the word for great, moor. And you can compare with the place Lismore in Argyll and Lismore in Ireland, which also have this element. But in Scotland, you find that less of the word for enclosure seems to be used for important secular centres more often than ecclesiastical ones or smaller. Is sometimes in Ireland used for many of the smaller sort of round sites that we get there. So we have lots of really interesting evidence for some of these possessions being significant. We also get some evidence for execution places that would have been important in some of these places. In Rainey parish, in the area that would have been Essie, we have a place called Croich Hill to the west of the Essie settlements and fields, which has the Gaelic element for a cross or a place for hanging. And also we have Gallows Hill as well in there too, in that area. And just to the east of that, just southwest or southeast of Tapanoth, we have Cross Hill, which could be, very speculatively suggesting that it is just a translation from that Gaelic word croich, and basically also means somewhere prominent where people could be shown to be hung. So there are some of these potential places, but we don't know what the dates of them are. Another potential place is Bell now, which is very close to Rainey itself and to the parish church, which is a small raised area. I very speculatively suggest that it could be something to do with assembly, but I think the evidence is very weak. So there are a number of different places in the Rainey parish area where we can really start to understand the way in which the landscape is structured. Very quickly, I'll mention duffers. I'm sorry if I'm going on slightly, but I'll try and be quick. Duffers and Berghead and that area. We're looking also at this area from Berghead to Lossiemouth and the area to the south, including a number of important places like the fort at Berghead, which was occupied from the 6th to the 10th century, Kineda, an ecclesiastical site with 7th and 8th century evidence, and there's important places in the hinterland. Later on, Duffers parish was a centre for the lordship of Duffers, the Freskin lordship there, which was centred at Duffers Castle, and in the Kineda, Spiny and Elgin, as well as Burney in the south, were centres of the bishops of Murray. What we can see in this area when we study it is that we don't get as many maps at all, but we do have some good charter evidence. There's an area of landscape change that's quite significant, with Loch Spiny being much bigger now than it was. It also, in Duffers parish, there are a number of mosses, bogs and small lochs. So it has been suggested it was the area from Berghead to Lossiemouth was more or less a peninsula or an island. But there are a number of routeways and fields that would have been in existence throughout this period. We also get some idea from roads that are mentioned in the sources that there were places in existence as well. So there's Kintry, which is head of the beach or shore, which would have been at some point the edge of Loch Spiny, but by the late medieval period was clearly quite some way from the edge. And we can see in Duffers parish itself that there were, as well as fields, there was a commonty at Spindlemuir in the southeast. There was also pastoral grazing in the north and the northwest, as well as a large number of fields in the area. We get in the area, we get a number of places that indicate ecclesiastical, early ecclesiastical usage in the Gaelic period. We get Annet place names that indicates a relationship of a field or place to a mother church. And we also get references in charters to place names with Logie, which refers to a church, probably from the Pictish period. One in this case, which seems to be close to or at the Church of Duffers. These place names that often don't exist now, but are only found in some of the evidence. But one of the key areas that we do get an idea of from the sources from the 18th century is an area in the west of Duffers parish, which is called Rose Isle. This is an area that Simon Taylor has argued could be the original name for Berghead, for the fort, with Pictish element Ross, for a headland, plus another perhaps personal name or other element. And it's interesting in that in our charters, it appears from the late 12th century, so very early on for the area as a major unit. And we also have evidence from the plans that much of the western part of the parish was either the key area, the possession of Rose Isle, which I've got marked in sort of browny red, and other areas that were part of this that could be grouped with it. So much of the area was part of Rose Isle. So what we can see here is a hinterland potentially of the promontory fort at Burghead that came to have the name came to survive in those areas, but not the fort itself. But we get a picture of perhaps of some of the hinterland that was producing resources for that hill fort, sorry, the promontory fort. So we have also, as part of the project, the idea that we'll be investigating the whole area of east to Lossiemouth and also to the south too. And there are some interesting place names in this area that could indicate assembly and central places. So we have some place names in Alvers parish and in Spiny parish with the area Cootehill, which is possibly from a Gaelic word for assembly sites, Covdor. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm sorry. And they are found in some of the early sources. We also have San Cathal, which appears in one charter and seems to be somewhere just north of the Lossie in the Bishop Mill area, which is now sort of a northern part of Elgin. And that is an indicator that was an early seat or fort in that area as well. So we get some idea of an earlier site there that could be earlier than the palace at Spiny that was the bishop's seat later on. So there are lots of things to investigate in the area. So to conclude, I think we do need to be very careful with the later evidence when we're trying to identify Pictish power structures, because things can change over time. And much of the evidence we can get back to seems to get back to the Gaelic area period, maybe 12th century to 9th century AD, rather than the one before. But I think what we can see when we look at this evidence, that there are a number of different sort of ranges of scale of units, from the settlement to the bottom to these possession units, to groups of possessions. And then if we think of it, units like North, Rainey and Rose Isle that were bigger and maybe earlier. And at some point, the situation was transformed into the creation of parishes as well. I don't think that we necessarily should see that there's a sort of order, that things are always dividing up, but maybe some of the larger units are the ones that we have most evidence for that they were the early ones. But I think we maybe can see that there's, at least in some places like Rose Isle, the North unit, and maybe Rainey, that there are these units that were related to these early centres, at least as a bigger unit, and they were then divided up. How all these units can be seen in a bigger context isn't very clear. We can relate perhaps the possessions to the townlands, some of the bigger units to the Davachs in Scotland as being the Davach, and then maybe the Baile Beata in Ireland. It could be a comparator. And we can also do comparisons on the other side, the bigger scale as well. But I think that's for another time. But I think what we can see here is different ways in which these units are interacting with each other, and that people, there is some sort of relationship with kindreds with these units maybe as well. And I think there's much to work on. I think I'll leave it there. But I think that we have to be careful, but I think there's still lots that we can find out about these areas. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. If you'd like to, actually, you might leave your screen on in case people want to raise a particular question around an image or something, then you can be easy.
Okay, yeah, that's great.
Through, won't it? Yeah, okay. So let's leave that on for now, and let's have a look at the chat. Well, going back to the start of the talk, Ruth asks, from one of your maps of provinces, has Fife really moved to the Lothians?
Is it?
I didn't see that myself, to be honest, but
Fife has moved to the Lothians.
Seemed to be.
Oh, if it has, that's bad. So it wasn't meant to be.
No, that's okay, isn't it?
That's it. That might be okay. It could be the other map. I don't know. Is it? I can't. My.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Is something's shifted?
Yeah. Look.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Oh, that's probably because that's just a mistake. So it's the map it went smaller, and then I had to move all the places, so I obviously missed that. It's meant to be in Fife.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ruth. That was a good spot.
Thanks for finding that. Sorry about that.
Kat Milligan asks about archaeobotanical records. I don't. Can you see this question? Quite long. I think, to be honest, you asked that question before you referred to Samantha's paper, and I think that's probably the one that she wants. It was forthcoming in Holocene.
It's in the Holocene. It's not published yet, but it'll be open access, so anyone can get access to it when it's out. I'm not quite sure which issue will be in, but the journals, So it covers the whole of the medieval period. I think up to the modern era, but I think the top layers are a bit more likely to be interfered with. But yeah.
Okay. So if that doesn't answer your question, Kat, just get back in touch with us. We can let you know where that's appearing. Claire was wanting a reminder of where the maps were made available. I'm assuming she means the ones you got from.
Lots of them are available from Scotland's people. They've been digitizing a lot and pulling up quite a few. So, and I don't think it's just from this area, but they're not all up. But there's quite a few of them are available now. And the NLS website also has been doing more estate plans too, and making them available from the nls.uk website. So if you search Scotland's people, you'll come up with it. I think they use the records from the National Records of Scotland archives in Edinburgh. So that's where they're coming from. So there might be some other places as well that have them. But the NRS, Scotland's People website, has a lot of the Gordon records that they clearly were involved in a lot of mapping in the 1770s, but there's some from 19th century too.
Ian is asking a question about Side and whether that can be from Suddy. Is there any evidence for which a saint's seat it is?
SIDE. I think that's a secular centre, so it's not a saint involved in that. I don't know how early that references to that go, but it seems to be at least there in the early modern period. I need to look into that more. But the saint at Kenmore is Alchmund, which seems to be an 8th or 9th century Anglo-Saxon saint. It's a very strange dedication.
Okay. Claire asked a question, but then she says it's answered later on by a later map that you show, so we can move on from that. There's a question. Well, somebody observes that Gartley, as regards Gartley, Grantley in Strathtay is also Gar and Tulloch. Yeah,
it's the same name. There's actually also, I found one of those estate maps there's a hill in Clap Parish which is also called that, and that has a cairn and there are a number of stone circles around. So I don't know if it's clearly some sort of hill. I don't know what the element is. Garan, something like that. That is the first element in both Grantley in Strathay and also in this example in Gartley Parish in Aberdeenshire. Yeah, but it's an interesting place, and it clearly seems to be the idea that it's some sort of important centre. Gartley itself isn't where Gartley is now, which is where the station was, but it's further northeast, and there was a castle there. And I'm looking for a little hillock as well, but there are one or two. But I think if you start looking too much for hillocks, then I'm not quite sure you just start seeing things.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I have a similar phenomenon. I'm trying to find the hillock for Kentillo, and it's damned elusive. I'm not sure if I wonder if that which was always a small place anyway, whether it could have moved or whether it's just been flattened. But I need to go out on the ground and have another look.
Yeah, I think these things can be quite small, but they're placed. The idea, I suppose, is that someone would stand on there and be visible. Yeah. So it all depends on what the surrounding area is.
And it's pretty flat around Bridge of Erne. So, you take all those buildings away of modern life, and actually a modest mound would be quite noticeable in the landscape, especially with a load of important people plonked on top of it. Someone asks whether Ross Isle could be Rose Isle and therefore Ross Eel.
Well, Rose is the Rose. I mean, as in English or Scots, or.
Well, the way that Alexandra has spelt it there, she seems to go from the spelling that we have today, Rose Isle, to Rose, as in R-O-S-E, Isle, and then she wonders if you can back project that to Ross Eel, I-L. Well,
it's the element Ross, which is found in Gaelic as well, but there's a British and Pictish, or some thinks a Pictish related word, which seems to be used in Scotland usually for headlands, so like Rosyth, Ross of Fife, and often quite important headlands. So his suggestion that it actually was the headland, and I'm not sure that Isle isn't necessarily what, as in our island isn't necessarily what the second element is. I think it's difficult to tell because the early forms of YLL or ILE, I haven't gone through all the early forms yet, but I think it doesn't look like it's what we would think of in Scots and English.
And Alexandra also asked later on whether you can provide an email for research questions. So I guess your university one she can get on the university's website, can't she?
Nicholas.evans@abdn.ac.uk.
But contact us if that doesn't get through to you, Alexandra. We'll get that passed on to you. There's a whole slew of thanks and praise before we get to the next question. There's a question about being able to watch this talk again. You will, Susan, be able to watch it. We'll be putting all the public engagement talks online, and we're in the process of doing that now. So just kind of, if you're following the project, just look out for future announcements. But it will be, you'll be able to reach it both from UHI website and probably Culture Perth and Kinross website as well. So just watch this space. Question from Daniel: is there any indication about why there are so many suggestions of ancient chapels, monasteries in Duffers Parish, Onthunk, Kintray, Rossile, Burhead Fort, Toon, Duffers Castle, Kirkhill, as well as Duffers itself?
Well, some of them, Unthank seems to be created in the 16th century as a development from the chapel in Duffers Castle. I think it's charter from the first half of the 16th century, which establishes that. So that's not that old. And the chapel itself seems to be after the castle's founded in the late, well, in the 12th century. So there is that there, but there's certainly there's quite a few. Well, Kintrae is actually in Spiny parish, but says the earliest reference we've got is to the old church at Kintrae. So there's something there, and that's possibly an early parish church that or parish that no longer exists. So that, but it is in the area, and it clearly, if we're thinking before the parish, then it's another church. Yeah, and in Duffers itself, it's interesting. There's three places: the Berghead, there's Duffers, and then there's, was it Kirk Hill? That they're sort of on the edge. The three points, the furthest away from the middle, really. That you can get, apart from being in the loch where the loch Spiny would have been. So I don't know if, I mean, it's to do with how far people would have to travel, but the chapel at Berghead looks as if it's quite significant with sculpture. And Duffers, Kirktoon of Duffers, where the parish church is has got sculpture too. Might have been significant. I mean, I think the area is quite important in a secular sense, and so would have been able to support important church patronage as well. So I think that's the two go along with each other, and I think the Kirk Hill is slightly strange because it's so close to Alves, which is about a kilometre or so to the south. So I'm not too sure really overall, but it does seem as if it fits with the important secular things going on as well. And why wouldn't people necessarily have parishes with lots of chapels if there's to get to, if it's sort of small ecclesiastical places in the area. But one of the strange things with Duffers is that the parish centre and the parish church are right on the east side, actually in the middle of the sort of peninsula. So there's a question of why it's there. I'm not quite sure, presumably strategically, but also it's closer to where the bishops of Murray are further east. So this seems to be a relationship.
Thanks very much, Nick. Gail asks for a link to the historic maps, and hopefully she'll have spotted that Alex Wolfe has kindly put the link into the chat. So if people want to see Scotland's people, the link is in there in the chat. Thanks, Alex, for that. More thanks and praise. Yes, the PowerPoint will be available, as we've already discussed. June Donald asks, or she says she lives by Mortlach, and are any good sources for my Pictish curiosity?
Well, I think direct sources, not huge amount. I mean, the centre of early bishopric, Alex Wolfe has got an article that's discussing some of the early history of that, maybe back to the 11th century. The name, I think, is more plus Tullach again, a great hill site. Again, another one of these examples of perhaps a significant centre, but a Gaelic name, as lots of the ones in our area are. I don't know that much about Mortlach because it's sort of in between our two study areas, and I have to sort of keep my work controllable. Yeah, but it's an interesting site.
Jez asks, if it is Garon, isn't that a type of horse?
Oh, you mean as in Grantley?
Yeah.
Well, I think it all depends on the exact form, and I don't know about that word for horse particularly. So I think it's usually Garen, but the forms do vary a bit. So I'm still searching for the early forms to work out what it might be. Yeah.
Bruce asks about David Earl of Huntington's lands, whether they have any role here, particularly charters. She's wondering if they stretch that far north.
Well, the Geary was one of the area lordship founded at the end of the 12th century for the Earls of, I think, David, Earl of Huntingdon. So that will impinge on my area of study, but I haven't really looked into that lordship in detail. And there is the idea that the Geary and some of the area here is on some of the richest agricultural land. I think Dr. Bruns pointed this out, and actually may be a really significant area for the kings of Alba and some of the kindreds, and presumably beforehand. And so it's important for people to keep good control over this area, that area, the Geary in particular, on the eastern edge of our study area. So I think it doesn't stretch as far as Rainey, but it does get into parts of this area. And I think you can see the Geary from places like Tapanoth, Kenmore, and it clearly would have been something that would have been on people's minds, that their neighbours are there and have this impressive land. So I don't know how far, say, Tapanoth, if it's at the early period, has when it's got the hilltop centre in operation with all these platforms going, how far people would have been coming to it, but it could have been people coming from as far away as the Geary or further even. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Oh, good. A couple of pronunciation questions. Brian offers or lets us know from local knowledge that Alves is pronounced Avis.
Okay, yeah. So I was going to go through all the pronunciations, but I didn't quite have. But yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's a number of places where I'm not getting it right. So thank you.
I don't know if I pronounced that right. I mean, I just read it as Avis, but there may be a more subtle pronunciation, of course. And James,
thank you. That's great.
Yeah, James asks how we pronounce K, and could this relate to Kenmore?
Pictish province.
Yeah.
K, that is how I pronounce it.
Yeah, that's how
I don't think we really know, because we don't know how long the sound is, or whether it's K or A, or we don't find it with an accent on it in the sources we have. So I think it's likely that the first bit is a K, or so. But apart from that, just go for it.
And Linda adds on that theme that Rose Isle is pronounced Rossile.
Rossile, I think
silent S.
Yeah, so it actually is very closer to the earlier sort of spelling forms. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question, because we have to start to wrap up now. And the first one I come to is, this is from Murray Cook, can Nick expand on the scale of fortifications between land units?
Scale of fortifications?
Between land units.
You mean how it differs in different land units? Is that the idea?
We could always, I don't know if Murray's there, we could always unmute him if Doug is able to do that.
I'm unmuted. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, okay, Murray, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Well, that's all excellent. I was just thinking, obviously with Rainey, there's a kind of complex there of differing sizes of fortification, from Tapanoth to Kenmore they're all different sizes. But if we're actually thinking about units and exceptional presentation, what is there a fortification at the small unit? There was obviously one slide with a motte and a church, but is the motte the parish? Is the motte the kind of shire? where might we go with fortifications, and kind of looking at the very, very southern end of the kind of Pictish area around Stirling. There's clearly differing sizes of fortification around there, differing dates. And I'm just thinking, again, I have a newly discovered fort, Pictish fort in Huntly itself.
Okay, great.
Do we have any of these? Gordon does know about it, but I'm not sure he picked up in the email. Just what we might be looking for these differing units. I mean, do we expect someone to have something fortified? And if struggling with medieval kind of parallels, a Bastille house to a laird's house, to a manor house, to a small castle, to a regional castle, are we any close to getting anything like that?
I think it's difficult to be able to match things up because of our level of knowledge, but I think it's a good question is whether we can see things as being important at different levels. And I don't know if we're at that point where we can, at least in this area. Certainly Kenmore is not on the same scale as what, in terms of the area, or something like Tapanoth, although there's, I think, a lot of resources seem to have been expended on the enclosure from what can be seen. Yeah, there's certainly, I think you're right that we could see that the bigger unit and the greater the lords and the bigger the community, if then you might expect a bigger concentration of resources. So Berghead would be, I think, at the much more at the upper end as well than some of the smaller sites. So I think you should be able to see that, but I don't think I've been able to match that up yet. At least there's lots of places that say there's, at least on first edition, a site of castle or something like that, and they're generally referring to something that was there in late medieval or early modern. So I think you possibly, if you did an exhaustive survey of a lot of places, you could start to build up that picture and get the scale and then match it up to different units. But I don't think I'm there yet. And some of the places, like one of the Tulloch places in Gartley, Tulloch has and on one of these estate plans has a castle hill as a field, and then Ken and ruins mentioned. But I don't know if there's anything else there. But I think that's a sort of interesting thing to explore further.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Murray. And I think with that, we have to now wrap things up. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and it's clear from all the comments that you've had an enjoyable time, so that's great. I would really like to thank Nick for coming along and presenting this fascinating analysis for us. I wish you could hear us clapping, Nick, but I'm clapping.
I can, thank you. Thank you for inviting me as well. It's been great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.